he took 300 and defeated the army, right? So that God would be glorified. And that's the whole reason that he does it. This week, we're going to change things up a little bit. If you paid attention to all of the names that I listed, they were all male names, right? We're going to talk about a lady this time. Woo! Right? We're going to talk about Esther. So, Esther is one of those books that you may not be super familiar with, so I'm going to give you a fairly short rundown on what happens throughout the book and a couple of really important key factors. So, first of all, the story of Esther takes place after the Babylonian exile. So what that means is a really long time ago, Israel was one nation, and then they split into two, and then after that, they ended up having nations come in, and they took all the Israelites as slaves, and they weren't in Israel anymore. That's the exile, when they're taken out from their nation. This is about 100 years after that, so not only would Esther not know what it was like to live in Israel, her parents may not even remember what it was like to live in Israel. Her grandparents may not even remember. And so it's a time where a lot of Jewish believers left their faith. They lost their faith and they started serving the gods of the nations they were in. The story we're going to talk about is going to take place in Persia. You guys might know of the Persian Empire. Same thing. We're going to talk a little bit about Esther and how she fits into that, though. And so, see, the book starts out, and it doesn't even start out talking about Esther. It's going to start out talking about King Xerxes, which has two X's in it, so you can say it like 15 different ways. I'll let you guys pick how you're going to say it. I'm going to say Xerxes. So, King Xerxes is deciding that he wants to just show people how much money he has. That's his entire goal in what he's about to do. So he says, I'm going to throw a sick rager. I'm going to throw a huge party, right? You guys ever been to a party? Not me. I went to Bible college. We didn't really have parties. But he throws this huge party. Now, for those of you that have been to parties, they usually don't last more than 24 hours. Yeah? This one lasted 187 days. He's throwing a huge party, right? And his entire goal is to just spend as much money as he can so he can show off. And so, since he's showing off, he decides, I'm gonna have my wife come out. Now, Scripture will actually mention his wife is extremely beautiful, and that's the purpose for him bringing her out. He wants to show off how good-looking his wife is. He sounds like the stereotype youth minister on Instagram. So, as he decides to bring his wife out, he says, go and get her. And his wife says, no, I ain't going. Now, I love this next part because I think it's really petty. But King Xerxes, after his wife told him no, decided that he is going to make a decree for the entire Persian Empire. And now, men, you need to rule over your wives. If your wife says no, you tell her yes. That's his decree because he got upset that his wife told him no. It's just kind of a fun thing to mention because, like I said, super petty. And that's pretty much who this guy is through the rest of the story. He's drunk, he's petty. But King Xerxes ends up making this decree that all men should rule over their wives and decides, since my wife isn't listening to me, I need a new one. Right? Yeah, that's what you do. So, like any good guy trying to find a wife, he decides, I'm going to throw a beauty pageant. Is that what you guys did? No? That's what I did. So he says, I'm going to throw this huge beauty pageant, and the winner of this pageant is going to become my new wife. He has thousands of women from all throughout the empire that come through, and they're competing to be the king's wife. Not the queen, because he had multiple wives, but just his wife. And so, as all of these women are coming through, we get introduced to Esther. And Esther is hiding the fact that she's Jewish so that she can compete in this competition. She wins, so go her. She wins, and in fact, King Xerxes is so infatuated with her, so drawn to her, so just captivated by the way that she looks, that he's going to make her the new queen. Not just a wife, but the queen. See, Esther goes through all of this, and then we kind of get told about her uncle. She has an uncle named Mordecai. And basically what happens is, after all of this, there's a couple of the king's guards that are going to start talking about killing the king. Now, I don't know about you guys. That doesn't sound like a smart idea, especially not out in the open. But they start talking about this plan to kill the king, and Mordecai overhears it. He tells Esther, Esther tells King Xerxes, and they foil the plot. Mordecai is basically elevated to this amazing role. He's not quite second in charge, but he's pretty important now. See, and then we get to meet a guy named Haman. So it's really setting up what's going on through the rest of this. Haman is the king's second in command, and he is going to be our bad guy in the story. So Haman, not good. Haman decides that he wants to flaunt his power, and he stands up in front of the huge crowd, and he says, "You guys have to bow to me." Come on, guys. You're supposed to bow. So everyone bows down to Haman except for one. And if you got to guess, it's Mordecai. Mordecai says, "I'm not going to do that." And basically, because of that, Haman decides to be really petty, and he's going to kill all the Jews. It's now legal that they kill all of the Jews in Persia. So they decide on a day, they get it all figured out, and it's basically going to be a huge execution. And then the king, the next day, has difficulty sleeping. You guys have a tough time sleeping last night? I did. I was talking to Nathaniel. I slept on my shoulder wrong, and I'm pretty sure that I can actually feel it grinding when I do this. It's not fun. I also didn't sleep well last night. So I don't know why I didn't think about doing this, but he decides, I know what will put me to sleep. I know exactly what will put me to sleep. I'm going to read the books of Chronicles. You guys ever read through 1st and 2nd Chronicles? That'll put you to sleep. That was his idea. He says, I'm going to have someone read that to me. I'm going to fall asleep. And basically, while sleeping and hearing about the history of the Jewish people, he decides to spare the Jews. But he's not quite decided yet. See, he needs a little push. And so Esther talks to her uncle Mordecai and decides that she's going to tell King Xerxes. She's going to tell him that she's Jewish and that he needs to save her people. They do. The rest of the story continues, right? And basically they end up with a counter decree that the Jews are able to fight back. The Jews are saved. And they have a couple more festivals that they get to partake in throughout the year because of it. I wouldn't be mad with having a couple more holidays in a year. So there's a few lessons that we end up learning through this. Like I said, this is a really short story, and I condensed it even more, so you guys are getting the Martin's paraphrased version. It's going to be trademarked here soon, so you remember this. And when you go home, read the story because it's really cool. But there's a couple of lessons that we get through this. If you're going to go home and you're going to read this story, you'll notice that it never uses the word God in it. It doesn't talk about God at all. Now, some of you guys might think, well, then why is it in the Bible if it doesn't talk about God? Well, it still serves a purpose, and part of it is because of that. See, it doesn't talk about God explicitly because it's trying to show what's called special providence. It's a really big word, and I'm going to define it for you guys. What that means is it's the way that God works in the world. So, oftentimes we'll call these miracles. Those are completely different. Miracles are things that could not happen unless God stepped in. Good example, water turning into wine, the chemical composition of a liquid completely changing. That could not happen without God stepping in. I don't know about you guys. I have not seen it yet. We're gonna find out later. But see, I have yet to see this, and it's because it only happens because God did it. Special providence is different. It could happen without God stepping in and performing a miracle, but it happens because he does. See, so one thing might be if you're having a child, right? and there's some kind of sign of complications. You have that baby, it comes out healthy. Special providence. That's God protecting your child through this process. Another one might be your favorite football team winning today. Maybe your fantasy football team winning today. That's me. I'm really banking on special providence on this one. But these are things that could happen without God involving himself, but God steps in and changes things, right? And so you can see this throughout the entire book of Esther, and it usually shows up as a coincidence, right? So Mordecai just happens to overhear the servants planning to kill the king. Esther just happens to win this beauty pageant, and then beyond that, just happens to become queen, not just a wife. These are all coincidences, but you can see that God is working through them for his purpose, right? And there's a lesson that we learn from this. When the Israelites go off to exile, a lot of the time, they end up doing stuff they're not supposed to. They forget about the Torah, their commandments. They forget to serve God. They start serving false gods. They serve idols that are in the nation that they're in, right? And it's a common reminder throughout all of the prophets that you are called to serve God and nothing else, right? The Israelites had a problem with that, and we can see it through a bunch of different examples. This is one of those, right? See, in about 100 years of these Israelites having completely forgotten everything that they learned about God in Israel, and the big word is assimilating, but it means you've become accustomed to a culture. You started living like another culture. In that process, they forgot about God. They've forgotten what they were called to do, right? But even though that's happening, God is still protecting his people. Way back in Genesis chapter 12, we get a promise that there would be a Savior through the line of Abraham. That Savior was to come through the nation of Israel, right? Well, how is that supposed to happen if they all get executed? God is working through this to continue his story. He's working through the background. Some of you guys might know exactly what I'm talking about. Maybe you got a job that you were completely unqualified for, right? Or maybe you had a couple of different things going on, and you were able to complete absolutely everything, right? This week is super packed for me. I'm super sick right now, if you guys can't tell. I've had like 3 Red Bulls to keep me going this morning. But we were at trunk or treats throughout the week, out in the cold. We were at trunk or treat yesterday for our church. And then today I was preaching. And tonight I'll be teaching youth group. All of this is what I asked Maddie last year to remind me not to do, because I remember how exhausting it was last year. I forgot about it, so that's on me. But all of this, right, the fact that I can get through this might be an example of special providence and how God continues to work through our lives. See, I have a story that I want to share with you guys from when I was in Bible college. I know you guys are probably tired of those stories at this point. But there's one guy I really want to talk about, and his roommate a little. I changed their names, so you can't look them up on Facebook or anything. I know that's exactly what you guys do when I tell you these stories. You go to my Facebook page and find my friends. But I remember I went to a communion meeting at a friend named Mark's room, right? My first year I lived in the dorms, and my roommate was actually really good friends with Mark. I wasn't really, but I went with him because he was my only friend. You guys can laugh at that, it's funny. He wasn't my only friend, but he's the only one I still talk to. So he and I go to this communion meeting. They were doing this every Wednesday, and they just wanted to invite people from the dorm so that they could spend time reflecting on God together, spend time in communion, spend time helping each other through whatever we're going through, right? Because for a lot of you guys, you might understand when you go to college, there's a lot of things that change. Your parents aren't there to watch over your shoulders anymore, and you don't always make the best decisions. That's me. I made a lot of bad financial decisions. I went to Bible college. I didn't do anything bad, But I spent money on a lot of stupid stuff. So that was a thing. And on top of that, you have to start keeping track of your own homework. That's important now. You got to keep track of when your tests are. You have to study in your free time, right? All of these things are things that change when you go to college, and you're not 100% prepared for. At least I wasn't. And so we're talking about what's going on in our lives and what we're really struggling through. And John shows up late. John is usually late to things. I love the guy, but he won't show up late on time to anything. And so he shows up late, and he comes in while we're talking, and he starts to talk with us a little bit about some of the things that are going on with him. He says, well, we're about 5 weeks into school at the time, and he says, I don't feel as connected to God as I did when I got here. I feel like I've been neglecting something, and it just feels like he's not there with me. And he starts to tear up over this because he understands that this is one of the most dangerous things that can happen to him as a Christian, is to start thinking that God isn't there. We know he is, but when we don't feel like he's there, we tend to make bad decisions, just like with our parents, right? If your parents aren't there looking over your shoulder, you tend to make bad decisions. When you feel like God is separated from you, you start to make bad decisions. He started to talk a little bit about this, and he was just starting to feel really burnt out. I love John. He's a great guy, but the fact that he was telling us all of this 4 weeks into school was troublesome. And so John, of course, he ended up doing great things. I looked him up. I've talked to him recently. But even though he felt this separation, he continued to move forward in his goal to pursue Christ. Today, he actually works on 3 different university campuses in California, working as a campus minister where he's leading Bible studies, helping international students to really grow a community that they can see Christ in, helping to disciple kids that are on their own for potentially the first time in their lives. He did all of this despite that disconnected feeling. He did all of this to continue to be courageous for Christ, because it's scary to do some of these things when you feel alone, right? There's another lesson that we get from Esther. So the first one, even though you feel disconnected from Christ, he's still there and he is still working his purpose through your life. Second, we've talked a lot recently about examples of how to be courageous. We've talked about, for example, Gideon, who was courageous in that he continued to cut down his army to an insanely small size before going into battle, because God had asked him to, so that he would have the glory, right? And it takes courage to walk into battle against 100,000 soldiers with less than 500. We've talked a lot about examples of how to be courageous, but we don't always talk about the circumstances. In Esther, we get to see something really cool. We get to see somebody who we may not always hold up as a hero like some of these other characters, like Gideon, who wins his battle and we hold him as a hero. Like Joshua, who throughout his entire life led the Israelites into battle and won, taking over the land that was promised to them, right? We can see these people and we say, those are courageous people. They were great examples their entire life. Esther teaches us a very important lesson about courage. It's that we don't have to be perfect to be courageous. See, we've talked a lot about what it looks like to do something courageously, but the circumstances surrounding it very commonly refer to somebody who is in good standing with God, right? Joshua, who was leading the Israelites, was in good standing with God when he was doing everything that he was doing. Moses, when he was doing everything he was doing, was in fairly good standing with God for the most part. Abraham was in good standing with God through all of these times that we talk about. But see, Esther was living a life at the time that did not reflect that she was close to God. She was living a life of idolatry, of sin, of all of these different things. And if you need an example, let me give you one. She married a Persian. According to the Torah, Jews were not supposed to marry people of another race. And that was so that they could basically just not fight about their religion, so that they could continue to serve God with their children, with their grandchildren, with themselves and their lives. And so Esther breaks this law, and there's a bunch of other ones that she does. And remember, this is because they are so far removed from their Jewish culture that they don't remember. Their parents haven't been a part of the Jewish culture. Their grandparents may not have been. And so it's hard to hold somebody to that standard when they're so far removed, right? But she continues through this story to do the courageous thing. Every time you read it, she is always going to tell King Xerxes of who she is, that she's Jewish, and that she wants him to save her people. Every time you read it, that's going to happen. And every time you read it, you're also going to see that she was not a perfect believer at the time. When we look at the way that we live our lives, right, it's easy to use that as a crutch, as a way to get out of doing something, right? Really good example. This is from myself. I remember when I was a teenager, I did not do any form of evangelism. And I can tell you exactly why. Because I just wasn't a good enough example of Jesus to do it. I didn't share my faith with the people around me because I was scared that if I did, they would get to see who I am and see that I was not reflecting Christ well. I was trying, but I wasn't there yet. Esther didn't care where she was at. She still made that choice. Like I said, we can often use that as an excuse to not do what God's called us to. The courageous thing, the brave thing, the God-honoring thing. But we can see through Esther's example that that's not a good reason to do this, right? And in reality, even when you get into your New Testament, it's filled with flawed people who are just following Jesus the best they can. Peter is a great example of this. If you read through your Gospels, Peter looks like an idiot. It's really true. In fact, he looks so ridiculous through your Gospels that when my senior year at Bible college, we did a sermon series on all the dumb things that he said. Because there's a couple of them. There's quite a few. And through all of this, you get to see Peter as a human. He's not perfect, but he's trying. And the first thing that we really get to see Peter do after Jesus resurrects and then ascends up to heaven, right, is he gets up and he stands in front of thousands of people and he preaches the gospel message. He preaches to a crowd of multiple thousand people that they killed Jesus and that he resurrected to forgive them from their sins so that they might be saved. That's what he does. The first thing, right? That's another great example of this courageous act that's taken part of by this foolish guy, basically. And like I said, it affects a lot of the way we live our lives. And so, as we begin to approach communion, I want to ask you guys to reflect on a few things. First of all, what Jesus did for us. Because if that is not the driving factor of everything you do, then you're not meeting Jesus' requirements. He asked that we would give everything in our lives to him. And that includes everything we do from Monday to Saturday and Sunday afternoon. It's not just on Sunday morning. I also want to ask you guys to reflect on what you're doing throughout the week to really bring yourself closer to Jesus. See, the point of communion is that you would remember him, right? That's what it says. I remember when I was in church growing up, we had a little table that said, "In remembrance of me," and I had no idea what the verse reference was my entire life. But that's why we do communion, to remember Jesus. And it's not just a Sunday afternoon or a Sunday morning thing. It's so that we would remember throughout the week, and we would have a physical reminder. See, as you guys grab your cups and you get ready for that, I want to ask you to prepare yourselves to not just reflect on today, but to reflect on the rest of your week.